necessarily. You do whatever you want to do.
All right. Good morning, everybody. If you want to go ahead and find a seat, we will get started in just a second. All right. We are happy to see you here at Formation this morning. You are in for a treat. Our speaker this morning, Linda Douty Mischke, is known throughout Memphis and probably the U.S. She is a teacher and author of 5 books, a spiritual director for over 25 years, and we are just so excited to have her with us this morning. So with that, I'll introduce Linda.
Thank you, Zach. It's awfully good to be back in the Great Hall. Even though we're sparsely populated, I know some of you are watching online, and we appreciate your presence, however it is coming to us. We're going to be talking and thinking this morning about spiritual growth in uncertain times. And don't go to sleep yet. I promise you that we're going to be a little challenged by what we can do to grow spiritually in these uncertain times. But I'm reminded of a quote from none other than Winston Churchill, believe it or not, who said this: "Never waste a good crisis." Now, aside from the fact that that is a clever quip and that certainly this crisis is anything but good, let the deeper meaning of that sink in. Certainly we have been and we are in the midst of crisis, but as all of us know, we've lived long enough to know that there is nothing that can happen to us that can't be grist for our growth if we open ourselves to it. And sometimes it's a messy and painful process. One caveat is necessary before I begin. You need to know that theologically, I'm not among those who think God sends tragedy so that we can learn the lessons we need to learn. But we can always stand on the truth of Romans 8:28. All things work together for good for those who love God and are called according to his purpose. Not all things are good, but eventually, with divine guidance, we can somehow glean some wisdom from whatever befalls us, and we can allow it to work toward our good. Now, I think this is an analogy that fits. Awfully simple, but it fits for me. It's one thing to say that if your child falls down the stairs and breaks his leg, that as a loving parent, you're going to do everything you can to help him recover and heal. You'll tend his wounds, comfort him, maybe even make him aware that it wasn't a good idea to leave his skateboard at the top of the stairs. But it's another thing to say that as a loving parent, you would push that child down the stairs in order that he learn some good lessons. So, whether he tripped or whether his sister pushed him, or whatever the cause is, you as a loving parent would help him put the pieces of his life back together. I know that's a simple analogy, but I think it speaks to God's role in the tragedies in our lives. Because God always stands ready at the bottom of the stairs, if you will, to help us form a new mosaic out of our lives, no matter how many broken pieces are there. And speaking of learning the lessons of change, this topic also brings to mind a conversation that I had years ago with my son and daughter-in-law, both medical internists, who were discussing their aging patients. And one of them said to the other, "It seems as people age, they divide into two camps. Those who decide to keep growing and adapting to change, and those who stagnate." Well, I certainly didn't want to be a stagnator, if that's a word. So like any good mother-in-law, I butted into their conversation and said, "Well, how can you tell the difference? What did you notice about them?" And they didn't mince any words. The first group is willing to rethink old patterns. They're open and curious and willing to ask the tough questions of themselves. And their opinions are not set in concrete. But in the other group, their opinions congeal. And then David said, "Oh, you know, Mom, people who say, 'Well, in my day,' as if they had turf to protect or a stubborn need to be right. People who are set in their ways," close quote. And then he added sometime later, "You know, folks like that are both bored and boring." So as I think of this group here at Calvary, online and present, I don't see any stagnant folks or people whose growth has congealed like a bowl of Jell-O. So as those who are interested in real spiritual growth, I invite you to look with me through the lens of growth as we explore some lessons offered to us by the current crises. So to follow Churchill's advice, let's not waste a good crisis. This is an opportunity to gain some wisdom. As many of you know, Walter and I have lived at Tresephant Manor, a retirement community, for, I guess, more than 6 years now. And I can attest that in a community of several hundred folks in semi-isolation, it is a virtual laboratory of human behavior, for good and ill. I want to share with you some of the experiences that have been shared with me and some of the things I've observed, both in the Tresephant community and in the community beyond that. And of course, I will maintain their anonymity and withhold names to protect the innocent and the guilty. So, almost without exception, I've heard countless versions of this statement: "I really don't want to return to my life exactly as it was. I want to make some changes, but I'm not sure what they are or how to go about it." Who knew that a pandemic and spiritual growth could be such natural bedfellows? So for a moment, I want to go through what I saw as some movements in the spiritual growth of folks around me. First, I want to highlight a big one, and that is from patterns to priorities. Now, tell the truth. How many of you, in your heart of hearts, were actually relieved when you heard the words, "That meeting has been canceled"? Or, "That club won't be meeting for several months. That group is on leave"? Maybe you were sad, maybe you were glad secretly. But it's vital to put those honest feelings under a microscope and be willing to ask yourself, is this an activity that has run its course with me? Or am I continuing it simply because I always have? Am I willing to disappoint someone else in order to be honest with my own feelings? Often we have become what I call committed to the commitment and not to the activity itself. Let that sink in. We become committed to the commitment. All commitments are not etched in stone. Maybe through the years, through the months, your interest has waned. What was once exciting has now become devoid of interest or sort of dreary. A wise teacher once told me, there's a great deal of difference between seeing what needs to be done and being called to do it. We can't do everything, we know that. If it's something that feels expansive, fulfilling, gratifying, then it's probably yours to do. If, on the other hand, you dread it, you're tired of it, and honestly, there's no interest there anymore, or you're wondering why you agreed to do it in the first place, then you've probably picked up someone else's cross. Those were her words. It may be something that did bring you fulfillment at one time, but it's time to pass the baton and do something new. Just because you said yes to something then doesn't mean that commitment is permanent. We may be called to fresh tasks or projects or to explore parts of ourselves that haven't been expressed before and haven't been visited. And it's also fair to ask, in the same vein, what people do you miss seeing? What people do you not miss? And what relationships really lift your heart? What relationships drain you? Who calls forth your better angels? God guides us, I think, through our emotions and our bodies as well as our heads. But we often allow the got tos and need tos and shoulds and musts in our heads to override that natural, organic call of the soul. I think we ignore those red flags to our spiritual and physical peril. So, what am I called to do at this point in my life? To paraphrase the famous Frederick Buechner, where do my deepest desires connect with the world's needs? Where can I replace I must with I want to? Now, this requires some self-awareness and radical honesty on our part. We've got to discern the difference between skills and desires. For instance, you may be a whiz at numbers, but you're really weary of being the treasurer of every organization. Your soul may want you to explore some other parts of yourself that have been neglected. And another thing about saying yes, we've got to face this. Sometimes we automatically say yes because it feels good to be needed. There's a real ego boost when someone thinks we would be the person to do that job. Besides, who will do it if I don't? It's all up to me. All those are signs that the ego is in charge. During these past months, most of us, at one time or another, were led to ask, okay, what matters most to me in my life right now? In almost all those cases, it was relationships. So we need to find ways to honor that knowledge about ourselves that includes intentional actions. Maybe a game night with the kids or community contact through Zoom. The possibilities are endless. To be practical, there was one woman at Trezevant who said she was pledging to herself that she would make one phone call every day to someone that she had lost contact with. And it was very fulfilling to her. She was able to go back over her life to realize that she had let some friendships slump, that she had neglected some people that she really wanted to keep contact with. And so that's how she honored that knowledge, that relationships were vital to her. Another man was moved to confront an unresolved family tension and move toward healing rather than waiting for the other person to make the first move. I think we're called to take a risk on behalf of reconciliation and healing, regardless of what response we get. Also, most of us have slowed down, maybe slowed down enough to learn how to listen more closely, to listen to each other rather than mentally planning our rebuttal or thinking of our next activity, and that is to listen with the intent to understand rather than the intent to reply. There's a great truth, and listen to this closely. Being deeply listened to feels so much like love that it's hard to tell the difference. Think of that for a minute. Being deeply listened to feels so much like love that it's hard to tell the difference. Now, the next movement is from complaint to creativity. I'm wondering how many of you, a couple of years ago, let's say, thought Zoom was the noise that a speeding car makes, or thought that FaceTime or Skype would expose your wrinkled faces. A major complaint during this crisis has been a lack of or too much time with family or friends. And we got sick of hearing ourselves complain about it. And we learned to get creative. We learned how to Zoom, how to FaceTime. We sent more texts. And even maybe at some point we began to feel more gratitude for this wonderful technology at our fingertips. After all, what did all our complaining accomplish? Zip. Now, some folks I know at Trezevant have begun, we've sort of encouraged each other in this, we've begun to laugh about how steep a learning curve this has been for most of us, and the tech glitches, and to help each other with those things. So we do that instead of moan and groan so much. And we've stretched our creative muscles, I think, and learned not to stagnate. One of the most creative projects that has developed at Trezevant was the brainchild of one woman. And she launched what is now called the Kindness Project. To begin with, she bought all the stock at a stationery store that was going out of business. And she put all those cards in a rack in the hall, inviting people to select a card for free, write a note of concern or sympathy or happy birthday, to be hand-delivered by yet another volunteer, especially to those in assisted living in the nursing home who were truly isolated. And they were able to hold the cards, read them over and over again, and it sounded simple, but it made an enormous difference in morale in those places. And they still remain off and on under a no visitors regulation, so that project is still alive and well. And it's really spread to a lot of people in independent living and in the cottages that have enormous talents that weren't being used. Now there's a sing-along with memory care residents, flower arranging classes for people in assisted living for their dining tables, even story reading sessions for those with sight problems. So it's a win-win. It's been wonderful for those who serve others and those who are the recipients. It's kindness personified. And this may seem like a funny aside, but it's still an example of how creative people can be. There was one couple that really loved to travel, and that was really their main entertainment, and they looked forward to it so much. Well, you know what happened to that? So they found great joy in a creative way to fill that vacuum. They made a list of all the places that they wanted to go that they were now probably unable to go to and wouldn't be able to. And it was amazing what they found on Netflix and National Geographic and other travel channels, and they began to play Let's Pretend. They went to those places vicariously over the TV and really had a good time. They got into the pretending and imagined themselves there, and I think it was a creative choice and very rewarding for them. There were many other creative choices. You probably have some of your very own. But we'll move on now to from sound to silence. Consider the words of the Psalms, "Be still and know that I am God." Now that verse doesn't say read another book and know, or listen to another podcast and know, or take another class and know. All worthy pursuits, of course. It says, be still and know. Now, we can't hope to make that connection with our inner landscape that we say we want to do when we never go there. We need to go there unimpeded, undirected, totally open. Now, the saints of old, I know beginning with Rumi in the 13th century and continuing to this day, have told us that silence is the language of God and all else is a poor translation. Which begs the question, do we really believe that the Holy Spirit can develop the fruits of the Spirit or transform us in the silence without our expert micromanagement, without saying what we want to happen, without giving God instructions? To sit in silence is an act of radical trust, a trust that says, I believe the Spirit can inspire me, enlighten me, encourage me, transform me without my interference, without judgment or evaluation. And for those of you that are committed, and that includes most everybody in this room, to serving others, we've got to remember that we can't give out of an empty cup. And our resources can run dry in a heartbeat. We have to say, what nurtures me? What fills my cup? Silence, art, inspiring companions, nature, music, a long walk. Notice what lifts your heart and pay attention to it. Or to borrow Nike's slogan, just do it. Now, I think our challenge here is to learn how to incorporate silence into our day-to-day lives without waiting for a time when we can go on retreat or when we, quote, have more time. So I challenge you to simply start with 5 minutes, no distractions, no evaluation, just complete openness and trust that God honors our offering of ourselves to steady transformation. I want to add that I don't know many things for sure, but this I do know, that the practice of sacred silence will change your life. It seems too simple, too good to be true. Maybe that's why it's part of the good news. You'll be giving the Holy Spirit a chance to work with you, to plant good seeds in your soul's garden without your direction. So trust the silence and make a plan to go there. Now let's look at from foe to friend. One of the most persistent dilemmas of this whole crisis situation has been loneliness, isolation, leading to depression and despair of all kinds. We've noticed it in others, and we've probably experienced it ourselves. We miss people. We miss community. The truth is, there's a profound difference between being alone and being lonely. And we're challenged to discern that difference and to allow that aloneness to become a friend instead of our foe. To go along that track more, it's been said that the best cure for loneliness is solitude, which sounds like a contradiction in terms. But in solitude, it's necessary that we let go of needing someone else to entertain us, define us, make us feel valued. And that is because in solitude, in some sense, we have to learn to become our own best friend, to value our own company, to be defined not by those people or projects out there, but by our identity as a child of God in here. We have the chance to see ourselves as God sees us, and as theologian Paul Tillich said, to accept the fact that we are accepted. And to take that even a step further, I think when Jesus challenged us to love our neighbors as ourselves, we're so accustomed to that phrase. Think about it as a statement of fact rather than an if-then proposition. Because I think the truth is, as we learn to love and value ourselves, we automatically love and value others more freely. As we forgive ourselves and our own flaws, we find that we're able to forgive and accept the flaws of others. I think it's part of the same spiritual flow, that it happens at the same time rather than in some sort of chronological sequence. Little aside here. I think in order for that to happen, we have to learn to recognize that voice that lives inside all of us. I think the psychologists call it the critical mother, but that's not saying a nice thing about mothers. But all of you know that voice. It's the one that says, you shouldn't have said that. You'd better do this or do that. I don't think they like me. You'll never be good enough. You better get a grip and clean up your act. Or a zillion versions of, you're not okay and you need to be fixed. When you recognize that critic inside you, fire her or him. Say, nope, you're not in charge of me anymore. You want to get in touch with your inner voice that can turn from foe to friend. When you do that, your inner compass is going to become clearer, less judgmental. You'll start to feel more comfortable in your own skin. And you'll find yourself having conversations not between the critical mother and you, but more between you and your authentic self, or between you and God's Spirit within you. I think you learn to enjoy your own company a little bit and learn the difference between being alone and being lonely. You might even learn to like the company you keep. And now I want us to move from worry to wisdom. We're sort of back where we started. There's plenty to worry about. We don't need to make that list. That's clear. But what then is the path to real wisdom? Many of you are followers or you've read other books by Richard Rohr. But his new book is called The Wisdom Pattern. And he posits that reality and spiritual growth in particular follow a certain arc, from order to disorder to reorder. Now, if we look at that arc, let's leave aside however we would define our past order, or we'll get stuck in the past. We're certainly familiar with the current disorder, that's for sure, and we're being invited to work toward and imagine the reorder without trying to control it. I don't think we can sit here and crank out an agenda today of what our reorder is going to look like in the future. That kind of control has been and always will be an illusion. The truth is, we can't control much except our response to things. But we can commit ourselves to be a channel of love and compassion in our personal lives, in our church life, in our communities, and especially this morning in this community called Calvary Episcopal Church. You know that there are things you can accomplish together that you can't accomplish separately. And I've observed through the years that this church is committed to that collegial brand of service. So we're not going to just look back at what we were, or you look back at what you were in the past, not simply learning lessons in concept. Then it's just a good idea. But actually moving from empathy to action, from good intentions to real change, all under the leadership of the Holy Spirit. I think that's the MO of this church, and you should be proud of that. In fact, as you join forces here at Calvary to make things happen, and you're really good at that, you seem to embody another bit of wisdom that I read about. It said, coming together is a beginning. Keeping together is progress. Working together is success. I think here at Calvary, you follow that arc very beautifully. Now, I want to close with some bottom line wisdom that moved me to tears when I first heard it years ago. I was attending a lecture, large crowd, and the main speaker was Dr. Jonas Salk, developer of the polio vaccine, which was, of course, is a medical breakthrough that changed the lives of millions. And the audience, I think, anticipated an exploration of new medical knowledge and that line of thinking. And about halfway through, his lecture took a different path, a surprising turn. And in his very gentle voice, he quietly said, "We must all do our part in the spiritual evolution of this planet." Well, there were puzzled looks all around. Some people started looking at their watches and finding out where the exits were. But he kept talking. He said, every prayer, every act of kindness, even a tiny act, every movement toward justice, every drop of goodwill is important and joins in a great ocean of love that already exists. And then he added these words that I've never forgotten. He shrugged his shoulders and said, of course, he'd received a fabulous introduction. He said, all these awards and accolades don't really matter all that much. There's only one question that finally matters. How well did you love? You don't have to invent the love. Just open yourself to it and let it flow through you unimpeded. Now, the answer to that question, how well did you love, is going to be somewhat different for everybody listening right now. But it exposes those times, I think, when we say we love humankind, but we really don't like people all that much. Or we send a great big check to the food bank and treat the waiter in the restaurant like dirt. So have the courage to ask yourself, what does love look like in my life as it is, with my resources, with my limitations, with my particular gifts and graces? And what does love look like in my community of faith? I think that's the prayer, the plea, and the process that will guide us and will save us. And now I invite any questions that you have. I appreciate your listening ears.
I wrote something. You want to hear it?
Yes, uh-huh.
I like your lesson.
Here, would you like to go up to the mic? Do you mind doing that so we can all hear you? Okay.
You can probably hear me anyway. Hello, can you hear me now?
Yes,
Can you hear me now? Are you sure?
yes, good.
I liked your lesson. I too am a senior. Date of birth 4/23/1949. Same date, not the year, of William Shakespeare. Born Edward de Vere. Was him, I say, and lots of other people do too, but, sorry, I diverted myself. Zoom, zoom, a car that speaks, or yes, FaceTime and Skype do show wrinkles, smiles, and the point of this more thank you. I wrote to Japan to try and get my 2005 divorce papers. Maybe God will help me with that. If I get it, then I can be married here. If I don't get it, I can't be. And I don't blame it. That makes sense, okay? I used to be every 15 minutes on TV, 5 minutes of commercials. It's now the opposite of that. Do you remember? We used to have a POTUS that didn't lie. And I'm not saying Biden lies, but I am saying the truth is a little, well, that's my opinion. And the best thing about America, I can have my own opinion on that.
Michael, did you have a question for Linda?
Question is this. How did you come up with all of this?
How did I come up with all this? That's a good question. The truth of it is that over time, ever since I was invited to speak here, I've let ideas develop mostly in the silence, to tell you the truth. And if I had something that I felt was honest and true, I would write it down. And then a couple of weeks ago, I got all of those little notes together, and this developed. So there is no authority to this except my own experience. That is totally it.
Well, it's certainly not the silence of the Lamb, is it?
I'm sorry?
It's certainly not the silence of the Lamb, is it? That's a joke, but it wasn't
Yeah,
very
I
funny.
know. I remember the movie too.
That's all I
Thank
had to
you.
say.
Thank you so much. Did somebody else have a question? Yes.
It's not a question, but I just...
Can you come to the microphone and slip your mask down just for a second?
Normally I'm loud enough. Yeah, you know it. Okay. It's not a question, but I just wanted to really thank you for bringing up that one phrase, okay? Be still and know that I'm God.
Okay.
It is the most healing thing I have ever experienced in my life.
Right. I
And when
agree.
it's whispered in your ears and you're on your knees praying, it means even more. So if anybody here is not familiar with that, I now have a plaque on my wall to remind me, because I'm not usually still nor quiet. But I just want to thank you for bringing that out, and it's another wonderful thing that's added to my life. And by the way, somebody has tried to use your name to connect with me on Facebook.
I'm sorry?
Someone tried to use your name to connect with me on Facebook. I was pretty sure it wasn't you. Though I would have liked
Oh, well,
it. Okay.
that's Facebook for you.
Somebody's cheating, okay?
Okay.
You know about that.
I'll ask one.
Okay.
Linda, part of your work is spiritual direction, helping people develop practices that might help in some of these movements. And you mentioned silence, try 5 minutes. I wonder if any of your practices have shifted or changed over the course of this challenging time. And then another would be, are there any other specific practices that you might recommend as we struggle to move across some of these that you suggest?
Thank you. I think you could hear that. What practices have come forth for me during this time? I think I've been more attentive to the silent practice. You know, we can fall off the wagon so easily. And as much as I talk about how valuable the silence is, sometimes several days will go by and I haven't honored that at all. And during this, I have sort of reconnected with the importance of having those pauses. What's changed, I think, is that I have started incorporating them into the day more. By that I mean, there are times during the day, you know, when we're in meditation or silence, we tend to breathe more deeply. It's more of an abdominal breath, a deep breath. And I have found that particularly if I get stressed about something, or let's say I get my feelings hurt, or I get irritated, or whatever the emotional reaction is, if I will take a deep breath, just a deep breath, and pause very briefly, that it helps to dissipate those feelings or to bring them into focus so that I can see the ego investment in them, for instance, or the fact that I can choose to respond rather than react. I guess that's where I'm going. But that pause, it's as if my body knows that that's what I need. And it's able to pause and affect my emotions. Is this crazy? So I find that during this past couple of years, I have been doing more of that kind of integration. I still think there's no substitute for sitting still for 15 minutes because you're able to get to a depth that you don't get to in one breath usually. But your body learns to help you. I don't think there's any surprise that the word for breath and spirit in Hebrew is the same word, is it not? Ruach. So those are all connected. Spirit, breath, breathe on me, breath of God. All of those things that we've heard for years, either in song or sermon, we need to put to use so that we experience things rather than just think about them or read about them or say, gee, that's a good idea. Okay? Anyone else? Yes.
Hi, thanks
Hi.
for coming today. I loved your stories and sort of some of the frameworks that you put on these journeys that we have. I, in this disruptive time, feel like I have recognized a lot of the things in column one, the patterns, the complaint, the sound, but I sort of feel suspended and not quite to the other piece of it, the priorities, creativity, silence. Do you have any words of encouragement or any words of wisdom for those of us who might be in the word two right now.
Yeah.
I'm in sound two.
You mean in the disorder? Order, disorder, reorder?
Yeah, it feels to me just sort of like something might be coming, something might be changing.
Right.
But I don't know what it is.
Right.
And so I'm just sort of waiting.
You know, one of the most difficult spiritual movements or fruits of the Spirit, I think, to develop is patience. We tend to, I want to set the agenda, check it off my list. We know how to do that. And we tend, I think, to decide things without proper reflection or without prayer, without spiritually chewing on something. And for me, this whole order, disorder, reorder, I'm somewhere in that mix too. It's almost like a trapeze artist when you let go of the one that's holding you, and there is this time before the next trapeze artist grabs your hands. I think sometimes we feel in the middle of the air like that. I have no real advice except to wait and see. Pray and listen. Notice the signals that you get. I think sometimes you're all familiar with the story of Moses and the burning bush, and he did stop. I think sometimes that we've got burning bushes that have information for us, and we walk right by a burning bush and we don't even feel the heat. We're on our way somewhere. We've got an agenda. We've got a meeting. We don't pause and say, what is this burning bush about? I may be talking in circles here, but I think that's sort of how we feel. And to make friends with uncertainty, I think is one of the biggest spiritual challenges we have. Because we want the answer. Sometimes just so we'll be intellectually satisfied. And to be in that liminal time of no answer, what's going to happen, there's no way to soften that or for me to say that it's not an enormous challenge. So, for those of us that are impatient, maybe it's time that we confronted that and made it a virtue, or pay attention to it at least.
Thanks.
Thank you, Heidi. Anyone else? Yes.
Good morning.
Morning.
Thank you for your comments. I particularly like the visual idea of the arc, and that we're in the disorder. My question is this, and I thought we're going to talk about that when you said phone a friend. One of the most distressing and probably destructive aspects of this whole era, is the anger. And I've never seen our country so bitterly divided and angry.
I know.
And I find myself in turn becoming angry. And how do we deal with this? How do we turn this around for ourselves? I know
Right.
we can't influence others, but for ourselves, how do we deal with this?
Great question. And you've almost answered your own question. We can't often do anything about the anger of others. I haven't had much luck. Have you? In trying to tell someone else not to be angry. That just hasn't worked. I think it does start with us. Who is it? Thich Nhat Hanh, who said, peace is every step. It starts with peace in our own hearts. And hopefully that will become as contagious a disease as the fear is. I hope, maybe this is my own Pollyanna self, I think that when we are at peace and when we let go of our own anger, that somehow influences the energy around us. And I think we just don't join the chorus. We hear all the anger and everything, and you think, you know, I'm choosing not to go there. I don't want to add to this. As I said, I haven't had much luck, and I doubt you have either, in convincing other people, either of my point of view or that they shouldn't be so angry. I mean, people just set their feet in concrete if you tell them they shouldn't be angry. I mean, I've tried that, it didn't work. Dealing with our own anger is a tough one. And I know some people who actually, again, using the breath, they interrupt the flow of the anger. Some people use just an imaginary, well, an image really, to feel that they're doing something with the anger. I knew there was a man once who said, I put that in my anger box. And I said, I'm sorry? He said, oh, in my imagination, I have this wooden, sort of pretty little oak box on my office shelf. And when I feel that, I kind of mentally wrap it up and I put it in the box. You know, whatever it takes, folks. I think we can, for me, interrupting the anger with the breath has been the first step. And also not feeding it. You know, there's this wonderful old fable about the Native American grandfather who, you all heard that? The Native American grandfather whose grandson comes up to him and said, I've had a horrible day, and Tommy didn't invite me to be on the team, and everybody's just treating me terribly, and they're talking mean to me, and blah, 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 blah. And he was obviously in a state of anger. And the grandfather said, I know what you mean. I have those two wolves inside me too. And the little boy was puzzled. And he said, I don't know what you mean. What two wolves? And he said, well, one wolf is peaceful and serene and understanding and loving. And the other wolf is mean and sneaky and angry, and they're in a war with each other all the time. And he said, well, if they're in a war, who wins? And the grandfather says, the one you feed. The one you feed. Well, I think a lot of times we can silently feed the angry wolf. We can think of the reasons we're angry and then think of another thing. And how many conversations have you been in with a group of people and somebody tells you something that's wrong with so-and-so, and then it's a game of negative one-upmanship. Boy, I'll tell you what's worse than that. Or there's a way that it feeds on itself. And we've all been guilty of that. I mean, it's irresistible sometimes to go on and feed the anger that is so lively around us. And sometimes we have to have the courage to change course. I'm not feeding that wolf anymore. Hope that makes it clear. Okay, time to go? All right. Thank you so much for your attention.
Just join me again in thanking Linda for being with us this morning. We are so grateful for you to be with us. I know every time I hear Linda speak, every time I'm with Linda, I learn something, and I can say that the 5 minutes of silence is the hardest thing I do. But Linda asked me to do it, so I do it. So if you could join me in thanking her one more time.